Hey everyone, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to part 32 of my ultimate guide to Logic Pro. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the stereo output channel in the mixer to finalize your project. Now, this video is not a mastering tutorial, but I am going to show you a few things that are related to master processing, like adding an EQ to shape the overall tone of your mix, adding a compressor to sort of glue together elements in your mix. I'll talk about loudness metering, using a limiter on the stereo output, and automating effects on the stereo output. But these are just sort of fundamental things that are important to know when finishing up any musical project in Logic. So again, don't think of this as a mastering tutorial by any means. There's a lot more to mastering than what I'm demonstrating in this video. But before we get into the tutorial, I want to quickly tell you about the sponsor of this video, Boombox. If you're a beat maker, producer, songwriter, or you're in a band, you've got to check out boombox.io and their incredible new music storage and audio file commenting tools. I use Boombox just about every day for my work. I use it to upload tracks that I've produced or mixed. I invite my clients or co-writers to be collaborators on the project, and they can add time-stamped feedback on each track. Then I take this feedback, make revisions, and upload a new version. This helps me streamline my project management and helps me get the boring parts of my job done quicker and easier. Head over to boombox.io and sign up for a free account today and get 4 GB of free storage. Now, in previous videos, I mentioned that the stereo output is sort of where all of the tracks in your project are summed together. So all of the tracks in your mix will eventually make it over to the stereo output. On all of these tracks, these are all set to the stereo output. But even if I were to change one of these, like if I changed this one here to a bus, for example, bus 2, you'll see that the output is now bus 2. So this channel is being routed to this aux track that's inputting bus 2. But even this aux track is still going to the stereo out. So I'm just going to delete that. And then to switch this track back to the stereo output, you click here on the Output tab, go to Output, and select Stereo Output. So now this channel is going to be routed into the stereo output again. So I like to think of the stereo output like an aux track that everything in the mix eventually goes to. It's your main final summing bus. Now, before we start adding any plugins to the stereo output, one of the first things you want to check is you want to make sure that your stereo output is not clipping or peaking. And you're going to want to do one of two things to fix this. So I'm going to go to the loudest section of this track. By the way, this project is available as a free download in the video description below if you want to work along with me. Let me press play. I'm going to check out the meter on the stereo output, and let's see how loud the combined volume of all these tracks is. Okay, so we're not clipping, but let's say that we were. One way you can do this is just to pull down the volume of all the tracks. Maybe I've got my fader set a little high in the mix, and this is probably going to clip now. Yeah, so the simplest way to do this is just to pull down all of the faders in your mix until your stereo output does not clip. What's complicated about that is if you have a track where you have volume automation written to it, like for example, let's say on the bass here, let's say that I wanted to sort of fade in the bass at the beginning here, maybe something like this. The problem with this type of adjustment is that the automation, the volume automation, will override any fader adjustments you make on the channel. So if I pull this up or pull it down, as soon as I press play or move the playhead, the fader is going to jump back to the automation value that's on the track. So if you go into a full mix where you've got a lot of volume automation and you start dropping the volume of all of the tracks, it's actually not going to affect tracks that have volume automation on them. So that's one situation where, maybe just pulling down all of the volume faders isn't going to work. So if that's what you have in your mix, let me show you how to deal with that. But first, I'm just going to delete the automation on this track. Okay, so I'm clipping again just for demonstration's sake. Another way to go about this is you can actually add a plugin to the stereo output called the gain plugin. So you click here, you go down to utility, And here it is, gain. Now the gain plugin does exactly what it sounds like it does. It allows you to attenuate or boost the gain of a particular channel. Now you can use this on individual channels to make volume adjustments after you've already written in automation, like the bass track from before, or you can use this on your stereo output to recover any clips that are on the stereo output. And you can also use it to sort of make sure that you have enough headroom for your mastering chain. Typically, I like to shoot for about -6 dB peak for my mastering chain. So I'm going to go ahead and just play that again and watch the meter here and pull back the gain until I get this to about -6. And remember, you can click on the peak indicator to reset it. Yeah, so I've got roughly -6 dB of headroom on my stereo output now. You don't have to make it exactly -6. You just want to leave a little bit of headroom because some of these plugins that we add to the stereo output are indeed going to add volume to the signal. So we want to sort of compensate for that so that none of the plugins that we add to the channel are clipping either. And by the way, another cool use for the gain plugin is there's a mono button in here. And what you can do is you can listen to what your mix will sound like in mono and check for any mono compatibility issues. It's not uncommon in a lot of mixes where stereo elements, left and right stereo elements, are anti-phase or out of phase with each other, which can cause these elements to get canceled out in the mix when played in mono. So if you're listening to your music on a system that's just a single speaker and both the left and right channels are summed together, you can lose some of that information. So using the gain plugin as a mono compatibility check is really nice to have, especially if you don't have a monitoring system with a mono button on it. Now, before I move on to adding a full master plugin chain, I want to show you how you can actually automate plugins on the stereo output. So let's say that instead of that volume automation that I had on the bass before, maybe I want to have like a filter sweep at the very beginning and have it affect all of the instruments in my mix. Well, you can do that with the stereo output. So I'm going to go to filter and I'm going to add the auto filter to the channel. And what I'm going to do here is turn off the distortion, LFO, and envelope units. I'll pull the cutoff all the way down, and I'll go with a low-pass filter, kind of similar to what I demonstrated before in a previous video in this series. But the thing is, there's no stereo output channel in the tracks area. In order to show the stereo output out here, you have to right-click or control-click on the stereo output and select this option, Show Output Track, or you can press Shift-Command-M. And then what you'll see is there's a stereo output track in the tracks area. The one downside of the stereo output track is you can't reorder it, you can't move it around, but we'll work around that, it's no big deal. So I'll hit A to show my automation. I can select an automation parameter, I can automate volume, I can automate the gain plugin, but here we're going to automate the auto filter cutoff frequency. And let's say that I wanted a filter sweep that opens up right at bar 6 when the drums come in. And I want this to sort of slowly sweep up from the beginning of the song. Maybe something like that. So in that case, everything in the mix is having this filter effect applied to it. You can use it for special effects later on in the song. So this is really helpful for a number of different creative automation effects where you want the effect on the stereo output rather than on individual channels. Okay, so let's move on to our mastering chain. So if you want to make EQ adjustments on your entire mix, you might consider using the linear phase EQ, but why not just use the channel EQ? Well, the channel EQ is what's called a minimum phase EQ. So this means that the crossover frequencies in between the bands can actually interact with each other in terms of their phase, which can cause some tone coloration in the signal. Now, that's actually fine for individual tracks and even, summing stacks and aux tracks. But for mastering, you don't want any phase interactions between the bands. And that's what the linear phase EQ is great for. It does not produce any sort of phase interactions at these crossover frequencies. Therefore, the tone of your master is not going to be colored or changed in any way due to phase issues. The only changes that you'll hear are what you do with the linear phase EQ. And you might think, well, why not just use the linear phase EQ all the time? Well, the linear phase EQ uses significantly more processing power than the channel EQ, so I really only recommend using the linear phase EQ on the stereo out, or maybe in situations where you have a lot of different instruments going to the same aux track or summing stack. But for individual channels and individual instruments, the channel EQ is just fine. So let me just shape the tone of this. I'm going to give it a bit more mid-high range, a bit more top end, and a bit more bass. Now we're clipping again, so keep this in mind that any adjustments you make to any of these plugins can add additional gain to the signal. So I like to compensate for this by pulling down the gain in the linear phase EQ. It doesn't have to be perfectly gain matched. The input and output don't have to be perfectly gain matched, but it's good to gain match them a bit. One other thing I like to do when I'm mastering, at least on my master EQs, is I like to add a high pass filter at 24, 25 hertz. This just rolls off the sub-low bass frequencies that, frankly, you're not really going to hear anyway, but sometimes if you take a master that's really bass heavy or has a lot of different instruments that are in the bass range and they're like colliding with each other, this can make the sub-bass frequencies really muddy, especially if you listen to this on a larger speaker, or maybe you're listening to it on headphones or earbuds, you might hear this. I just find that it helps to clean up any low sub-bass rumble that doesn't need to be there anyway. Yeah, so we're just getting a bit of a lift from the linear phase EQ here. Now, another thing you could try out, it's probably not going to work so well on an electronic track like this, but it works really well on rock tracks and acoustic tracks, and that is to add a compressor to your stereo output as like a final bus compressor. For this, I like to use the vintage VCA, which sort of models an SSL bus compressor. So when I use bus compression on everything in a mix, the goal here is just to tame the most peak transient points of the song, just so everything comes together and is sort of glued together as a cohesive unit. So I'm not looking for a lot of compression here. And there you saw I used the distortion unit just to give it a bit more bite and a bit more brightness as well. But one of the things that's really easy to do with compressors is you pull up the makeup gain and you A/B it, and all of a sudden you think the compressor is doing a whole lot of work when it's really not. You're just hearing the mix louder than it was without the makeup gain. So it's easy to come back and say, oh, that sounds better, but the reality is you're just hearing the makeup gain. So I like to sort of hear this at a similar volume level and then A/B the compressor, and you'll notice that the effect is a bit more subtle than you might think. And this is why I've rolled down the output gain on the compressor as well to compensate for any added volume from the distortion unit. Now, the only time loudness should really be a factor when finalizing your mix is at the very end of the stereo output signal chain. This is where you can dial in your final loudness setting for your track so that it fits with other songs on streaming platforms. Now, to do this, I'm actually going to get rid of the compressor because I just don't like bus compression on electronic music. That's just my own personal taste. But in order to dial in your final loudness, there's a 2 plugin combo for this. First, you're going to load up the adaptive limiter plugin. And then after the adaptive limiter, you're going to load up the loudness meter, which is under metering here. And before we get into the limiter, I actually want to sort of explain what the loudness meter does first. So I'm just going to bypass the limiter. What the loudness meter does is it will show you a reading of the loudness in your song, and it uses a special type of value called LUFS. This stands for loudness units relative to full scale. Some people call this LUFS. I just call it LUFS. And the way you can use the meter is you just click start and then play back a significant portion of your song. Generally, you want to go with the loudest portion of your song. So I'm going to just hit play and then I'll press start and we'll get a reading on the loudness of the track as is. Now, there's a lot of different values in here, but the one that's the most important is the integrated loudness reading. So right now you can see that the integrated loudness is negative 18.1 LUFS. Typically, most streaming platforms want at least negative 14 LUFS, so that's sort of a minimum standard. And how loud you go up to in your mix is completely up to you, but personally, I try not to go much higher than about negative 10 LUFS. So generally, I try to shoot between like negative 14 and negative 10. I find that's a pretty safe range. But if you go beyond negative 10, sometimes you can get away with negative 9 or maybe even pushing into negative 8 if you have really intense, really loud music. But anything above like negative 9 to me just sounds like trash. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I've never heard a mix above negative 9 LUFS that sounds better than that same mix below negative 9 LFS. And the reason for that is because we're actually going to add the gain. We're going to add the loudness with the adaptive limiter plugin. And when you make your master too loud, you end up squashing the dynamics of the song. And this sort of contributes to a lack of clarity in the mix as well. So louder is not necessarily better. Okay, so I know that I want to shoot for somewhere around negative 14 to negative 10 for my loudness level, but how do you actually control your loudness level? Well, that's what the adaptive limiter is for. A limiter is like a compressor, but instead of setting a ratio like 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 10 to 1, the ratio in a limiter is like 100 to 1 or infinity to 1. So with a limiter, you can add gain, and this will add volume to the track. But then you set a maximum peak value, that's the output ceiling, and no matter how loud you go with the limiter, the signal will never pass the output ceiling. So you can kind of think of the output ceiling like a threshold control, but unlike a compressor where signal can pass the threshold, in a limiter, signal does not pass the threshold. So just to demonstrate this real quick, I'm going to set the out ceiling to negative 2. Watch the peak value here on the stereo out as I push up the gain knob. So it got really loud there for a bit, but notice that the signal did not clip. The clip light didn't go off, and the maximum peak value is negative 2. That's because we set the output ceiling to negative 2. Now, with most streaming platforms nowadays, they require a negative 1 true peak. So the first thing I do when I'm using a limiter is I set the output ceiling to negative 1, turn on true peak detection. And then what you can do at this point is just play with your gain knob and dial in the loudness level that you want. What you're going to see me do is pull up the gain, make an adjustment, then reset the meter, make another adjustment, then reset the meter. And you're going to be constantly resetting the meter after every adjustment because the meter does take some time to catch up. And you do want to play a significant portion of the loudest part of your song. Generally, about 30 or 40 seconds is recommended to get an accurate integrated loudness reading. So around -12, I can probably push it a little bit more. Now, the loudness level doesn't need to be exactly 10 LUFS. You shouldn't master with your eyes. Like, you shouldn't shoot for a specific value. What you should really shoot for is maximizing the volume of the track while still maintaining a level of clarity and detail in your mix. If you find that pushing the gain knob up too much is completely crushing the dynamics in the song, then you obviously want to dial this back, even if you haven't gotten to -10 yet. In fact, I think I'm going to pull this back a bit, and I'm going to shoot for maybe around -11, just as a safety. And you have to pay attention to the gain reduction. This is going to show you all of the parts that are being cut, that are being limited. And if you have too much gain reduction going on, the more percussive elements in your mix, like the kick and the snare and the drums, these can sort of lose their punch. So you don't want to limit too hard either. And there you go. I've dialed in a final loudness setting of around -11 LUFS. I can still hear everything in the mix very clearly. Just keep in mind, this is a very simple musical example. If you add vocals to this, if you add more textures, more layers, more elements to it, all of those things combined means more loudness. So if you have a more dense mix, don't be surprised if you can't boost things quite as much as I'm doing here. So that's how you can use the stereo output channel to finalize your mix. In the next video, I'll demonstrate some different ways to bounce your final mix and how to export elements of your song if you need to take them over to another DAW for mixing. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. As always, thank you so much for the support, and thanks for watching.